questions.
Welcome, Yamhill County, to Speaking Frankly. I'm your host, Howie Harkema, and our tagline is, "And how we doing?" Well, today we're doing great. It's Friday, and I've got a couple incredible guests with me today. I have Shyle Reuter, who's the Education and Outreach Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Mid-Willamette Valley. Welcome, Shyle.
Hey, Howie.
And we have Jamie Gatewood, who's the Education and Research Coordinator for the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Mid-Willamette Valley. Welcome to you, Jamie.
Thanks for having us.
Because of COVID. So we're going to go right into it. So is the Fair Housing Council a nonprofit?
Yeah, we actually are. We are a private nonprofit organization.
Very good. And what is the Fair Housing Council of Oregon's mission?
Well, we are a civil rights organization, and we proactively promote housing justice, housing inclusion, housing equity, and our mission is to end illegal housing discrimination. And we do that through access to education around what fair housing laws are. We do that through access to enforcement of fair housing laws. We also do that through public policy work as well. And the whole purpose is to increase access to housing choice, equitable housing choice for groups who may be more likely to have housing choice blocked to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you, Shyle, we'll start with you, give us a little bit of background that prepared you for this really important work that you do?
Yeah, certainly. I'll go all the way back. So I would say that my first experience around housing inequity happened when I was a child. I was raised by a single mom in Kearney, Nebraska, and we certainly had housing opportunities blocked to us because at the time women were treated, differently in housing. And as a single mom, there was definitely, like, being this single parent household, our familial status, we were definitely treated differently in housing. And so my first experience with housing discrimination happened at a really young age, which is part of what brought me and drove me to doing housing equity work. In 2001, I started working in HIV/AIDS services as a medical case manager, and then transitioned into 2002 to working in a housing program for people living with HIV and AIDS. And so worked heavily in the background of housing equity issues for people living with disabilities, trying to get into housing, and started teaching tenant education courses in 2002. And part of that included these important civil rights laws in housing and teaching these rights to people who were very impacted by housing discrimination and inequities, and just really built a passion for this type of work and empowering our community. And so that's what brought me forward to doing this work with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon.
Yay. Jamie, would you give us a little bit of your background that prepared you for this work?
Yeah, definitely. Shaw, thanks for bringing that up, about how you grew up and how that affected, your childhood. And I didn't really think about it before, but we had a lot of similar experiences because my mom was a single mom of four, and housing was blocked to a lot of families back in the 80s. And so my mom was telling me she remembers when she was looking for housing and it said no pets and no children on the advertisements.
Wow.
So we definitely went through some of that too. And so that's why those laws exist. They're so important. But my background is mostly in education, and I worked as an early childhood educator and home visitor for about 12 years. And during that time, I learned how to advocate for families, and I also learned about the struggles that they face, especially when they're experiencing things like poverty, disability, and discrimination. And I also learned a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural sensitivity. And I love to help others because, like most folks, I genuinely care about people in my community. And that is definitely the kind of work that feeds my soul. So that work and that thinking led me to another position later for about 2 years, where I worked at an amazing nonprofit care farm. And there I managed their education and volunteer and internship programs. And I think just thinking about like community health and well-being, one of the important aspects there was that we grew hundreds of pounds of food and donated that to the food bank to support food sovereignty in that community. So when it came time for me to look for another position, and I found the listing for the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, I thought, this is an organization that is really helping people on a broad scale. It's an organization that's focusing on groups who are most affected by discrimination, and it's a mission that I can get behind. So I was very excited when I got the job back in September, and I can say that the organization lived up to all those expectations and more. And so I'm truly excited to work here, and that's how I came to the Fair Housing Council of Oregon.
Congratulations. That's fantastic. So what is the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Mid-Willamette Valley?
Yeah, so the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we are a statewide organization. So we have staff in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon. We've recently expanded into Central Oregon in the Bend and Redmond area as well. And we have staff also in the Portland metro area. So we're the statewide civil rights organization. And we really are helping people who are, number one, experiencing housing discrimination. So people can call us if they're experiencing housing discrimination. We also work to educate housing providers. So we have a hotline where housing providers can call and get more information about what fair housing law is. And we really believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we want to be on that front end, and we want to be, we want to be educating people and educating the community. So we are working to educate consumers of housing. We're working to educate housing advocates, case managers. We work to educate, these housing providers, and it could be nonprofit providers, shelter providers, more traditional property management companies, mom and pop organizations. And then we've also been recently diving into doing a lot of jurisdictional outreach. So outreach to governmental bodies and groups. And that's been really fantastic and exciting as well. So we offer a lot of different types of services. We do a lot of different types of things as, a statewide nonprofit organization. What it means in the Mid-Willamette Valley, we have in three different areas of the state right now. We have community advisory groups, and one in Southern Oregon, one in the Mid-Willamette Valley, one in Eastern Oregon. And in the Mid-Willamette Valley, we cover Polk, Yamhill, and Marion County. And that's really to get a pulse on what are the discrimination issues that are very specific to this area. And then we get input from that group. And then that input actually helps guide the work that we're doing in the community, guiding the work that we're doing with these jurisdictional bodies. And excitingly, very recently, we were able to convene all of these groups together and help to give input to a statewide plan to help address issues of housing discrimination throughout our whole state, which is extremely exciting. That plan ideally is going to be released in the next month or two, so we'll be able to see.
I have a couple questions that fit into what you just said,
Yeah.
and either of you can answer them. What do you find the most challenging in working with landlords? And of the three regions in Oregon that you're dealing with, what do you find to be common and unique to those regions?
That is a great question. So what I will say is that one of the things that's most challenging in working with landlords is what we find more often than not is that landlords want to follow fair housing laws, but they just don't know what they are, because there's so many different types of laws that affect housing. So there's landlord tenant law, there are, city zoning issues that come up, city code issues that may come up as well. And then there's also these fair housing laws, these civil rights laws. And so what we find oftentimes is that housing providers want to do the right thing. They just don't know what the laws are. We find that these bigger property management companies do a lot of work. They educate their staff, but it's oftentimes these mom and pop landlords that don't know what the laws are. And mom and pop landlords are so important to our community because they're oftentimes the landlords that are going to be more flexible around screening criteria for folks that have barriers trying to get into housing. So we have a really hard time connecting with those landlords because we want to connect to them. We want to educate them. We want them also to be fair housing advocates. we want to help them understand what these laws are so that they're limiting their legal liability around it. We want to create these inclusive communities as well. And then I would say we do have a small handful of landlords who know that these laws exist, and it doesn't matter to them. They don't believe in this ideal of community inclusion, which unfortunately then contributes to the problem of homelessness that we see throughout the whole state. And then I'll let Jamie actually talk about the issues that we've seen amongst the 3 different areas of the state with the community advisory groups.
Great.
Oh, Jamie, you're muted.
Sorry, there was a loud truck going by earlier. So, yeah, I would say that luckily we're working with these community advisory groups, and we get a lot of input. And these groups they're housing providers, there are community members, there are shelter providers. So they're working on the ground, and they see a lot. And I would say there's probably like 3 main things that we're hearing most from Yamhill County. And one of them is that we're seeing discrimination against people with disabilities, which is also the most prevalent kind of discrimination that we hear about in the state of Oregon. This kind of discrimination could look like false or inconsistent information from a landlord at the time of an application. So maybe there's someone with a disability or living with a disability who applies for a unit, and they're told the unit is still available, but then when they come to check it out in person, maybe their disability is evident, like they're using a wheelchair, then the unit is magically no longer available, or maybe the move-in fee has magically, mystically changed or doubled. And so that's some of the stuff that we're hearing about with discrimination against folks who have disability. Another one is that these people who live with a disability might need a change, to the unit or maybe a policy, and that's called a reasonable modification or accommodation. And it is the law that, that those requests are met if they're reasonable. And so sometimes we're hearing that those are not being met. And oftentimes it has to do with assistance animals. And assistance animals, for somebody who's living with disability, it's not their pet. That's something an animal that they need for equal access or enjoyment to the unit. And so, they really do need to be, those requests need to be met. And that's something that we're seeing sometimes that they're not. And it is a law that they meet those requests. Another one is that we're hearing about discrimination against source of income. And what that means is that some landlords are refusing to accept Section 8 vouchers, which is like that federal housing assistance for folks who are living with lower incomes, or rent assistance vouchers from other local agencies like YCAP and places like that. And that is illegal to refuse those. When those are being refused, what's happening is that people like families with children are being blocked from housing. The folks who use those most often, folks who maybe have disabilities, other folks who are living on lower incomes. And so that's something that we're seeing often. And even in advertising, sometimes it comes up like you'll see no Section 8, but this is actually illegal. And then the other kind that we're hearing about discrimination that we're hearing about in Yamhill is based on national origin or race. And so this is especially towards the community of Latinx folks and Pacific Islander folks. And these groups, and others, are very vulnerable to illegal discrimination because they rarely reach out for help when it happens. And rightly so, because there's a fear there of losing their stable housing if they speak up to say something. And there is a fear of, depending on your immigration status, you might not want to say anything because you could be afraid that you could be reported. So language barriers also play a role there. And this often means that folks are living in subpar housing, in places where maybe their landlord's not fixing things that break, but maybe are fixing things that break in other people's units because they're taking advantage. They know that these groups don't often speak up. And that's why we're right there in the community working with the, service providers and caseworkers who are supporting those communities. So if something comes up, that's a discrimination, they know who to call. And so that's why we're right there working in the community, one of the many reasons.
And so some of that discrimination that Jamie's talking about in Yamhill County around source of income, we also see that in the other areas of the state as well. In Southern Oregon, how that's showing up right now is housing providers not wanting to accept housing vouchers that people have who are trying to relocate because they've lost their home due to the fires. We're also seeing issues where Airbnbs or these vacation rentals are converting into longer term rentals. And, they're not understanding that because they're a longer term rental now, they actually have to follow fair housing law, or they're not willing to accept these housing vouchers, which is also a very interesting phenomena. And then with the national origin issue in the Southern Oregon area and the Eastern Oregon area, we're seeing that mainly with the Latinx community happening in those areas of the state.
So when a law gets updated, how do the landlords get the information? And are they working from past laws that have been updated?
That is such a good question, Howie, because the reality is that if a law gets updated or passed, unless the landlord or property management company is proactively seeking out this information, they may not know or understand that the law has shifted or changed. So that's a real challenge because there's no type of licensure process that housing providers need to go through.
Right.
There's nothing that says that they have to get updated on landlord tenant law or fair housing law. And unfortunately, that process really creates a lot of liability then for housing providers in our community. And it's so interesting because there's so many industries that we have where there are regulations put in place where people need to be licensed to do that type of work. And that doesn't come into play in the housing arena. And unfortunately, there are some very clear consequences of that. And unfortunately, there's consequences for landlords because of that as well. I don't think that any landlord wants to end up being in a lawsuit because they've broken any laws, but there is nothing that's put in place, by the government that says, this education is required so that these landlords have the education. And unfortunately, the reality is if a landlord says, I didn't know, that doesn't then somehow exclude them from liability if they do break the law, which is really, it's unfortunate that there's not some type of a statewide process in place that would require landlords to get that education because ultimately it protects them.
So beyond the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, is there advocates trying to work on this issue in Oregon?
I've heard rumblings from time to time that people in different groups have been trying to work on it. It's been suggested, and I don't know right now if there's any groups where there's a lot of traction around it. There may be. I'm not tracking on that issue.
So let's move on. What is fair housing, period?
That is such a good question. Okay. So what fair housing is, it's the right for people to be free from housing discrimination in housing processes like the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So it covers all those types of housing. So it means that those entities that are housing providers in some way, shape, or form, this could be landlords, this could be banks that are financing loans, this could be real estate agents that are, selling, mortgage lenders, financial institutions, that they cannot treat somebody differently because of their protected identity. So those protected identities, those are called protected classes. And on a federal level, those protected classes are race, color, national origin, and religion. Those were the first 4 protected classes added in 1968. In the 1970s, we saw sex, sex at birth being added because of the women's movement. And then in 1988, we saw familial status, meaning families with children, added. And then we also saw people living with disabilities added. Now, prior to 1988, nearly 70% of landlords in the state of Oregon would not rent to families that had kids, which is a really, really striking statistic. If we think about 70% of the housing stock would have been blocked to families with kids. And we can pull up statistics like that for any one of those groups, which is why they're protected. And then the state of Oregon goes on to add extra protections for source of income. So those Section 8 vouchers or those housing vouchers. It also adds marital status. So if somebody's married, single, widowed, or divorced, it shouldn't matter in a housing transaction. Sexual orientation and gender identity is also protected in the state of Oregon, as is survivorship of domestic violence. Now, interestingly, I don't know if anybody's tracking this issue that's come up recently on the federal government with HUD, but Biden has asked HUD to start to re-examine and open cases on a federal level that may have been sex discrimination based on LGBTQIA plus status, which is a real significant shift from the federal government because sexual orientation, gender identity has not been considered on a federal level part of that sex protection. And it's looking like now we may see that shift, which is really, really exciting.
So what types of services do you guys offer?
So the services that we offer education, a lot of education. We have that landlord hotline. And then we also offer services of enforcement of fair housing. So if somebody believes that they've been discriminated against in housing, they can contact our hotline. We don't have income requirements. We also speak English and Spanish on our hotline, and for language needs outside of that, so we use the language bank, so we are an accessible organization. So those are the types of services that we provide. So if somebody has experienced housing discrimination, we can help them to advocate. If advocacy doesn't work, we can help them, to file a claim with HUD, Housing and Urban Development, or BOLI, the Bureau of Labor and Industry in the state of Oregon. And then also sometimes we can help people get connected to legal counsel in a situation where it's a very extreme case of discrimination.
So if I was living in Mount Angel and I was Russian and I only spoke Russian, you could have that online translation into
Yes,
Russian?
we would arrange an interpreter so that we could work with you so that you could get appropriate services.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what types of housing discrimination are you seeing?
Yeah, so the types of housing discrimination we're seeing statewide are a lot of what Jamie had just spoke about. So it's like 50% of the calls we get are related to disability. We're hearing about a lot of source of income discrimination, a lot of national origin discrimination as well. Those are the ones that really come to the forefront in what we see. We also see and believe that there's an underreporting of housing discrimination in specific communities that don't want to report. And we're really looking at communities based on race. So African American, Black communities not reporting discrimination, the Latinx community not reporting discrimination, the LGBTQIA plus community not reporting discrimination that's happening.
Yeah, and I will say the stat on that is that only 1 in 10 cases are ever reported. And, that is a great way that folks can help us. If you're seeing discrimination, please give us a call, because that connection can mean a big difference for someone's life if it means they get to stay in stable housing.
Oh, and you know what, Howie, another issue that we're seeing statewide that I forgot to mention is an increase of acts of hate and harassment.
Yeah.
And that started to be on the rise as of November of 2016. And I'll let you draw your own lines to what that meant.
Yeah, I get that.
Right. And we are hopeful that as of January 20th, of 2021, we may start to see those cases drop, but unfortunately, we've not seen that happen yet. We've also seen cases of housing discrimination related to Asian and Asian American communities on the rise locally and nationwide because of the stigma that had been attached to COVID-19 and where it originated. So we're seeing those communities be targeted as a result as well.
So working with your clientele, do you have to do Zoom meetings or mostly by telephone or emails? How do you do it in a COVID pandemic?
That is such a good question. So when it comes to hotline, we have moved all of our operations virtually. So everybody is working remotely and from home. But the exciting piece is this has really allowed us to expand our services out statewide in a way we haven't been able to do before. And it's so exciting because no longer is transportation time an issue in how we're providing services. So for example, for hotline, people can email us, they can access us on our website, fhco.org. They can call us on the phone Fridays from 9 to noon. And then for our educational services and our community engagement services, we're doing all of those virtually over Zoom. So literally, I could be, physically in my home in one area of the state and then be transported to Southern Oregon for a training and then go to Eugene the very next hour and then go to Eastern Oregon the very next hour. Whereas pre-COVID, pre-Zoom, we didn't use these kinds of tools. And so it's really exciting because we have seen more outreach as a result of this. With that said, I do need to also mention, though, we see that certain communities do not have equal access to internet services.
Yeah.
So we're seeing the Latinx community unfortunately impacted in this way, other lower income communities as well. So people living with disabilities. So there is an impact there. And so we have heard that there is a push statewide to get some momentum around getting access to those virtual services to those communities that don't have equitable access.
That is so important in this time frame due to the fact that not everywhere has great internet to begin with.
Yes.
There are a lot of dead spots across Oregon.
Yes. And especially when we look at rural Oregon, remote Oregon.
So how are you working in communities to address some of these problems?
Jamie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot I was muted again. I think I'd have that under wraps by now. But, so I would say, like Shyle mentioned, we are a statewide organization, and that means that we understand that there are different needs in each area of the state. So we know that rural Oregon has different barriers to fair housing than those larger metro areas like Portland, maybe, and Eugene. We meet with those community advisory groups that we talked about, and we have one here, like Shyle said, in the Mid-Willamette Valley to identify barriers to fair housing and housing choice. And then we work towards breaking down those barriers. So last year, we were able to, with the help of our community advisory group, create some new guides, so educational materials and translated materials related specifically to housing issues in Yamhill County. And that, I would say, is probably true for Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon. They're doing that same work in their communities and creating the materials that are needed for the people there. And having that input, from folks who are on the ground doing that work is so important. So we know we're reaching the right groups, and we hear who needs this training most. And those folks also help us to connect to some landlords, which is not always the easiest thing to do. I mean, there's no big state organization that all the mom and pop landlords belong to with a list of everyone to contact. So they are kind of tricky to contact, and making those connections on the ground are really important. And then another way that we are connecting in the community to combat housing discrimination is through those service integration team meetings. Those happen all throughout Yamhill County, and I go to, about 6 of those, I think, every month. And I get to talk to teachers, I get to talk to service providers, I get to talk to social service workers. And there are people there who are working in the in the jails and helping people to transition, back into the community again. And so they're keeping us informed, and we're working together so that we can really hone in on the issues that are happening in each area of the state. And then they know who to call. If something happens, they're like, oh, I know a fair housing person. I trust her. I trust that she won't, push my client to do something that they might not want to do, or share information they might not want someone to hear. So building those trusted relationships, I think, really help to further fair housing.
Well, it's great to be able to network and know the names and be able to contact them quickly as well. So that's all awesome. So how does...
Howie, to add to that, yeah. I also would say that we have been working really hard to create stronger ties with the different jurisdictional bodies, so governments throughout the state as well. And we've been doing a lot of trainings around Oregon's history of housing discrimination, segregation, displacement, so that we're giving these jurisdictional bodies really clear understanding of how we got to where we are right now as a state. Sure. And those jurisdictional bodies have been really responding to this information. And so we're going to be deepening our ties with those jurisdictional bodies, where we're going to start working with them around things like zoning, around land use planning, so that they really understand how to create inclusive communities. And one of the materials that we created that Jamie sort of alluded to was what's called the Good Neighbor Guide. And so it's a really good way to basically, give this to people in the community or jurisdictional groups, organizations, city council members who are, friends of fair housing, so that they can understand how to have these conversations around creating inclusive communities.
I've only got 3 questions left.
Okay.
How does fair housing law influence the houseless population of our different counties?
I'll take that one. So while houselessness is not yet a protected class in Oregon or federally, all housing providers, including shelters, they have fair housing responsibilities. So we work really closely with the shelters to help them to stay within compliance, understand all of these civil rights laws. So that's one intersection. Another one is that many people experiencing houselessness are also members of protected classes. So many folks who experience houselessness live with a disability. Many of them are people of color. Many of them maybe were born outside of the US. Many of them have children. And so that means that they all fall under a protected class here in Oregon. It could mean that maybe they have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. So I will say that this is a way that we as a state and as a county need to work to pass legislation that adds more protected classes, because I think that houselessness should be one of those. And I think a lot of folks who do this work would agree. And they should be protected by these laws, just like many other groups. So I say those are probably the biggest crossovers. And also we are working hard to promote non-traditional housing. So it could be promoting, building shelters in different communities because it's so needed. There's not enough. And so we can break down some of those stereotypes about what that would mean about bringing this very important housing into your community. And that's another thing that Good Neighbor Guide is amazing about. It really explains why it's important, how to talk to your friends and neighbors and city council members about these issues, because you can educate others. You can become educated and educate others around it. Yeah.
So next to the last question, what can community members do to assist Fair Housing Council of Oregon in reaching their goals?
So I would say that, like I was just mentioning, that Good Neighbor Guide is a great place to start. It talks about what kinds of housing is missing, and how to advocate for it, and how to advocate for inclusive, equitable, and accessible communities for all Oregonians. So having more diverse housing means being able to meet the needs of diverse communities. And Oregon communities, including Yamhill County, they need more affordable housing that reflects the wages earned in the area, needs more emergency shelters like we talked about, and transitional housing, maybe for folks who are recovering from like drug and alcohol addiction, or people who are living with a disability. Maybe they need some more like supportive services to stay in stable housing. And so reading that Good Neighbor Guide and then getting involved at a local level is really amazing place to start. And you can contact your local planning office and ask to be added to their email list or their notification list for new projects and proposals, so that you know what is happening. And when those things are happening, you can go to the city council meeting and talk about why you as a community member would like to have this housing in your community. And I'd say that also just being educated on what discrimination looks like. So when you see it, you can help maybe to connect that person with our office. Again, like 1 in 10 cases are ever reported. So that help is huge for us. One more great way that you can is there's also a guide on our website for housing providers and landlords. And so if you know someone who is a housing provider, like we all have, like my mom was a housing provider. So like all of us within our communities know people who are landlords, and they, like Shyle was saying, most of them really care about their community. They want to know who is affected by housing discrimination so they can support those groups. And they're like the folks who can maybe make exceptions in their rental criteria. So by providing your friends and family and neighbors and community members with that guide, you are helping to further fair housing in your community.
And another couple ways that people could get involved, Howie, is that we also have an email list as an agency. So people could go to our website, fhco.org, and get onto our emailing list, our newsletter. We send out updates about what's going on around fair housing law. And then also I should mention that we have our annual celebration of the Fair Housing Act coming up Thursday, April 29th. It's a virtual event. It's from 5:30 to 6 o'clock. People can get information about that. We also have a poster contest that's happening right now, and it's for kiddos that are first grade to 8th grade. The theme this year is it's fun having all kinds of neighbors. And for kiddos that, put in entries, there are cash prizes for kids to get involved. And it's such a great way for parents to learn to talk to their kids about what these fair housing laws are and why it's important to include, kiddos within that conversation, because kids are so open to these ideas of like everybody belongs in my neighborhood. So those are a lot of ways that people can get involved with fair housing.
And one more thing, don't forget, if you vote for an administration that is supporting fair housing, you are supporting fair housing. And that also means with your local city council people too. So you can look and see, like, who are they? Do they support fair housing? Yes, I want to vote for them. So that's really important.
I know this question is going to put me over time, but that's okay. I differentiate between affordable housing and low-cost housing quite a bit, because affordable housing usually means that someone is going to purchase a less than super costly home. But low-cost housing is where most people can afford it, whether it be Section 8 vouchers or some way they can afford it. Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Affordable housing is actually a term that's used within the federal government that says people have to be of a certain percentage between like a certain window of MFI, so medium family income, to be able to qualify for this housing. And what we find is that a person who is working full-time on a minimum wage job can't afford affordable housing. So really what we need is, we want truly affordable housing for people who are at lower income. So those things are actually very different things. So if people are hearing that term affordable housing, it actually ends up referring to something very specific, which unfortunately right now refers to more of, middle class that's at lower income.
That's correct.
But doesn't refer to, people who are below middle class, which is very, very unfortunate. So we do need housing that is accessible to people at lower incomes within our community.
Well, there's a lot of people that work service jobs, such as clerks at stores, gas station attendants, that can't afford to live in McMinnville or Newburgh. They have to live in the outlying cities and towns because of the less rent cost.
Right. And the interesting thing is that when we start looking at that, there's not good public transportation that's coming to and from those areas. So then we're looking at people adding in the costs of transportation instead, which then adds in car insurance, which then adds in gas. And so then there's additional costs for people, additional burdens, and also loss of time because of commuting and things like that. So then we're seeing these groups that, are already burdened become, even more burdened as a result of not being able to live within the community that they're working.
This is my last question. It's for both of you, and you each have about a minute. Tell me about, and the viewers, about your feelings of doing this so important work.
I would say I can do it in less than a minute, Howie. I would say, just as my experience as a kid growing up with a single parent, I don't want anybody to have to experience being othered in the way that my family was, in the way that we were when I was a kid. And I know that for me, it's important to live within the solution, and creating equitable, just, inclusive communities is part of the solution. And so I feel like I am doing work that is important to the majority of our community.
Jamie?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with all of those things, including about how I was raised as well, and not wanting anyone else to have to go through that. I think that this work can be hard because we have to talk about a lot of difficult topics, a lot of hard history, but also we have so many things that we can celebrate, like diversity, and we have so many times where we get to help people in the community, and that's, like I said, it's what feeds my soul. I know I'm furthering fair housing in a really big way, and so like I leave the day feeling good, like knowing that I did something that is making a difference for others in the community. So I know how important the work is, and I'm just really excited to be doing it.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Shyle Reuter, and thank you, Jamie Gatewood, for really filling us in over this half hour of how important fair housing truly is to all of our communities throughout Oregon and the Mid-Willamette Valley. And have a great day, and I'll let you know what's going on when it's going to air. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thanks so much, Howie.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.